Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to Preterist Pilgrim Weekend 2020. My name is John Watson. I am the preacher at the Westside Church of Christ in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I'll be speaking to you a couple times this week, I think, and looking very much forward to that. I consider it an absolute honor and a great privilege to be able to do such, to be able to present God's gospel. And don't think for just 1 second that eschatology is not the gospel. We are taught in Revelation 19 and verse 10 that eschatology is what proves Jesus. So you just check that verse out and you'll see what I'm talking about. So this idea is extremely powerful. Let me give you a little bit of background, though, about how powerful this is. It absolutely changed my life. I have been preaching and teaching the biblical truth about eschatology for about 4 years. And in that time, I have just learned so much. It has absolutely transformed my life in ways I never could have imagined. I now know what it means to be a gospel preacher and teacher of God's word. And that was something that was very foreign to me in a lot of ways before this. I've been preaching since I was 17 years old. And it wasn't everything that it should have been. We'll just put it that way. Because I wasn't teaching the whole counsel of God. But now that I see this and we're teaching this, and it is just powerful. I really thought that, when I started teaching this, when I saw this truth, I mean, there were always things that stood out to me that I couldn't explain all those years. So, for 35 years or so, roughly, I preached something that I really couldn't explain. But then once I finally yielded and gave into the truth, now the power of that is just amazing. And I'm seeing it transform people's lives, and it's transformed mine without question. And I'm going to show you some of the things that helped me get to this place here tonight. We'll talk about some of those things, most of which I have learned recently. And this is all still kind of new to me. I'm 4 years into this. That's long enough to get a college education, I guess. But I'm at least getting an education in the Scriptures. And let's talk about some of these things. My assigned topic here this evening is Revelation chapter 17. Plenty of topics we could read about in Matthew, but we're going to talk about Revelation chapter 17. There are a lot of things here that we're going to consider, so I'm going to do my due diligence. I'm going to get this out of the way right at the very beginning. I'm going to read my prepared statement. So here you go. Chapter 17 of Revelation is Yahweh's divine indictment on Jerusalem and the reason for her impending cataclysmic judgment, depicted and equated by the imagery of the judgment of ancient Babylon. Now, what on earth do I mean by that? Well, basically this. God is using the same thing that we do, and He's doing the same thing that we do, even in our society. Go back for just a moment in your mind, and if someone were to say to you, we will never forget in regards to 9/11, they don't have to go through absolutely everything about that day and start at the beginning and just, go from A to Z of all the events. All that's conjured up in your mind because it's fresh on our minds still. It's been, about 20 years roughly since that happened. And we still pretty much have that in our collective conscience here in America and even around the world. So what God was doing through the inspiration of these writers was evoking those thoughts and those ideas whenever Babylon is mentioned. So we think about things from a 21st century, especially in this country, obviously, Americanized kind of viewpoint. Well, they didn't think that way in the first century. Consider this. Every single book in the Bible, all 66 of them, are teaching God's way of thinking, not ours. So this is eternal. And it's something that God wants us to understand. So we have to go back and we have to see it from their perspective, the way it was written, under those guidelines, if you will. And when we do that, it does absolutely change our perspective on things. And we stop seeing things as very physical. We start seeing spiritual things. We see how God operates. Okay, so that's the Hebrew thought process that is being brought out. So whether you're Jew or a Gentile, that's the teaching that Yahweh wants us to understand and wants us to learn. So if we leave out the first 3 quarters of God's inspired writings, then that last quarter of it is going to not make so much sense. And we're going to be kind of led down a cow path that others have trod that isn't leading where the Lord would have us to wind up. So This is why we need this imagery from the Old Testament. This is all God's doing. So and if you leave this lesson with nothing else, I hope that you get this, that when you hear the term Babylon, it should be equated with somebody who was in favor with God, then out of favor with God. It's not like they were actually in favor with God, but they were kind of a jewel in his crown, so to speak. And he held their cup and so forth. You'll see this momentarily, I think. But Babylon was suddenly destroyed. And it's the same imagery that we have with Jerusalem and Israel, of course. And we see that this is equated there, and the similarities are just uncanny. Lots of people want to say, our brethren in our fellowship are really good at saying, well, similarity of language does not mean identicality of thought. Well, really? There are just lots of coincidences here. Another thing that I heard years ago from a preacher named Pete Wilson, had a fantastic series on prayer. But there was something that he said in there that really just has stuck with me for a long time. He said that he noticed he was trying to convince some of his coworkers about prayer, and they were skeptical about it. They said it was just coincidental when he prayed and then things happened. And Pete said, well, one thing that I've noticed, when I pray, coincidences happen, and when I don't pray, coincidences don't happen. Well, the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of coincidences that you see when you start studying the entirety of God's Word, and you're able to plug some of these things in, and that's what we're doing here this evening. So I want you to see that Babylon is Jerusalem. It was considered that in the Old Covenant or that Old Testament. We can read it many times through the Old Testament. And it's still considered that in the New Testament. And that thought is brought out in Revelation, and for good reason, which we will see. I want you to see that there are a few constituent elements that I think appear from Jeremiah chapter 51 and also in Revelation chapter 17. We're going to talk briefly, although not in depth, and I'm going to give you a couple viewpoints on the 7 kings and 10 horns. We want to talk about the collaboration that the Jews had with Rome, and I know I was cramming a lot of stuff in here, and maybe touch on this idea of the war that was there to take place. So let's jump right into this, and let's go here to Revelation chapter 17. The one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, come here and I'll show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. Now he's talking about the judgment of a great harlot. And as we read through this, it's called out that she is Babylon. She is a great harlot. And he says, this is the judgment. This is basically what I had there in my statement, right? So this is the judgment that's coming upon this great harlot. Now I have to make a point here. If the great harlot is Rome, how can that be? Because Rome, I think Rome is talked about here, don't get me wrong, but how could the great harlot be Rome if Rome never entered into a covenant with Yahweh, if he was never married to Yahweh, Rome was never married to Yahweh, how could he or she, depending on how you want to say it, how could Rome become this harlot and commit adultery on her husband if she was never married to? So that just doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense to me years ago, and it still doesn't make sense. But what does make sense is that this judgment of the great harlot, who is Babylon, follows the biblical teaching that it's equated to Jerusalem. We'll see this as we go along here, so don't give up on me just yet. In verse 2, we read, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality. Now, so the kings of the earth. Well, let's think about this idea of the kings of the earth for just a moment. Logically, 21st century logic might dictate that these kings of the earth are Roman emperors. But that's not what he's talking about. I'm here to disagree with that. That these kings of the earth, I suggest to you that this is what Jesus was talking about, the kings of the earth in Matthew chapter 17. So I want you to examine this with me briefly. And I'll just touch on this. I certainly don't have time. This is my second go-around with this video. So there's things that I missed the first time, and I'm not going to miss other things the second time, and we'll just see if it all shakes out. But anyway, Matthew chapter 17, in verse 24, starting and following through the end of the chapter, we see Jesus illustrating to us what the kings of the earth are. Now, when we look at these kings of the earth, check this out. When they had come to Capernaum, those who collected, the 2 drachma tax, came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax?" And he said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from the strangers?" So Jesus calls these guys, says that they're collecting a tax for the kings of the earth. Well, you still might say, well, there's no proof here that this is not the emperor system and the national tax of Rome and that kind of thing, or even the local tax for that matter. But listen to what he says. He says, "From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from strangers?" And when Peter said, "From strangers," Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are exempt." The sons of who? Well, Jewish history teaches us that the sons of the priests were exempt from paying the temple tax. So even in Capernaum, they would have been collecting this tax that was later sent through by caravan, armed, guarded caravan, by the way, into Jerusalem for the temple and the things of the temple and so forth. So these kings of the earth, we see, were these priests, or this priestly system. So back in Revelation chapter 17, he says that the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. All of Judaism, and even Josephus qualifies this statement, when he said that generation of Jews was the most corrupt that had ever been. Now that is significant. And Jesus, or Yeshua, through inspiring John, confirms this very thing. And he says here, notice this again, he says that these kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. In other words, you've got these rulers and these leaders, and they're just leading everybody. It's kind of like the blind leading the blind, right? Leading everybody to destruction. And that's exactly where it all led. So these kings of the earth, obviously, based on what we can read in the scriptures, there's other passages I guess we'd go to, but I learned in the first video I didn't have that much time to do this. So anyway, so obviously these kings of the earth are somebody that's Jewish, right? So the kings of the earth have to be this Jewish priestly system. Now, so we're reading this, and we go on here to verse 3, and it says, "And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast." Well, who's the woman that he's talking about? What's the antecedent to this? And he was just talking about this great harlot. The harlot is a woman, obviously. And he says this woman, this harlot, is sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. We're going to talk about this in just a moment. "And the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet." Whoa, how are the priests adorned? You answered that question. We know the answer to that question. "Adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of unclean things of her immorality. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth." Now, isn't this exactly what we just read? Just summed up in one phrase? It's exactly what it is. Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. This is a female. She's leading people astray, of the abominations of the earth. So here it is. It's just what we just read in the preceding verses. Now, let's look at a few illustrations here. One of the things I want to show you that the Old Testament illustrates that Babylon was Rome. Not Rome. See, it's still stuck in my head sometimes. It's hard to get that training out. Even though I know better, sometimes it just pops out. Which is another reason I had to redo this video. Anyway, so let's look at Micah chapter 4. So Micah chapter 4 and verse 10, it's very clear. It says, "Writhe and labor to give birth." There are a lot of similarities here, right? Similarity of language. That are illustrative of what happened to Jerusalem and how it was described about Jerusalem's fall by Jesus and his apostles in the first century. Not only them, but the people who prophesied about it in the Old Testament. Those prophets. Because remember, 1 Peter says that they were prophesying for that time and that generation. 1 Peter chapter 1. So verse 10, "Writhe and labor to give birth, daughter of Zion, like a woman in childbirth. For now you will go out of the city, dwell in the field, and go to Babylon, There you will be rescued from there the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. And many nations have been assembled against you who say, let her be polluted and let our eyes gloat over Zion. But think about this. What is the time frame here? When we look at the very first chapter or first verse of chapter 4, it says, and it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the peoples will stream to it. What time was that? That was in the first century. That's when Jesus came, the Messiah came. He did his messianic work. It's also the time that he is to return and come back again, not in our future. And it's the time that salvation comes. It's the time that this truth flows from Zion, from the mountain of the house of the Lord. And it will be raised above the hills, and the peoples will stream to it, and many nations will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, and to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us about his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. And from Zion will go forth the law, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So what we see here is that Babylon and Jerusalem are being used interchangeably, even though Babylon was yet to be destroyed at this point in history. So when we look at these things, it just becomes utterly amazing. But one of the things that's absolutely amazing to me are some of the parallels and the coincidences, if you will, that we see from Jeremiah. And I think John is drawing heavily off of Jeremiah and many of the things that he said in Jeremiah chapter 51. Now, obviously, we don't have time to go through all of these nuances, but let's look at a few of these things. So Jeremiah chapter 51, if you were to go back to the 50th chapter, really that gives us a great running start. And just a few things there maybe you might think about. He says, your day has come, the time when I will punish you, talking about Babylon. That's about verse 31. But in the 51st chapter, notice what he says, the very first verse. He says, thus says the Lord, behold, I am going to arouse against Babylon and against the inhabitants of Leb-Kamai or Chaldea the spirit of a destroyer. Now, obviously, that was Cyrus. I will dispatch foreigners to Babylon, and they will that they may winnow her. In other words, this is judgment. This is the same judgment that we see taking place in Matthew chapter 3. When they're there, they've got the winnowing fork in their hand. They're separating the wheat from the chaff. Isn't that judgment? And may devastate her land. For on every side they will be opposed to her in the day of her calamity. These are the same words that are used in regards to the destruction of Jerusalem. So this is why when we look at and we hear this term Babylon, and we see it used in Revelation and other places, and even Peter, when he was using that and describing himself being there, we'll look at this in just a moment, he was using it for the same reason. But let's not look at that just yet. Anyway, verse 3 says, let not him who bends the bow bend it, nor let him raise up his scale armor. So do not spare her young men. Devote all her army to destruction. They will fall down slain in the land of the Chaldeans and pierced through in their streets. For neither Israel nor Judah has been forsaken by his God, the Lord of hosts, although their land is full of guilt before the Holy One of Israel. Flee from the midst of Babylon, and each one of you save his life. In other words, there was this small group who was going to listen and get out of Babylon. Wasn't that familiar? Matthew chapter 24. What about verse 15 and following? Jesus told them the same thing. Get out of there when you see this taking place. Do not be destroyed in her punishment, for this is the Lord's time of vengeance. He is going to render recompense to her. Babylon, listen to this, has been a golden cup in the hand of the Lord. We just read this in verse 4 of Revelation 17. Intoxicating all the earth. The nations have drunk of her wine. Therefore, the nations are going mad, the New American Standard says. In the ESV, I think it uses, therefore boast themselves do nations. So they were boasting, apparently, that Yahweh was with them. Everything was maybe they didn't necessarily realize that the God of heaven was with them, but that, hey, they were prospering, and they boasted about that. So anyway, let's go on a little further here. So Babylon was a golden cup in the hand of the Lord, intoxicating all the earth. The nations have drunk of her wine, therefore the nations are going mad. We just read suddenly in verse 8, suddenly Babylon has fallen and been broken. I want you to think about this. This was all what Jeremiah is recounting here and what he's prophesying, what he's talking about. This is all about the destruction of Babylon. This is about how Babylon was suddenly destroyed. In the midst of her thinking everything was just fine, all of a sudden she's destroyed. That's exactly what happened with Jerusalem. And the parallels here are just too immense for us to go into at this point, but I hope that you see those things. Now, did you see any of this in our reading from Revelation chapter 17? Consider this. So what we had read in Revelation chapter 17, Jeremiah 51 and verse 13, he talks about these many waters. You who do dwell by many waters, abundant in treasures, your end has come, the measure of your end. So if you were a Jew in the first century reading Revelation chapter 17, do you suppose that there's any chance whatsoever, because of your upbringing and your religious training and the constant pounding into your head about the Torah, the Tanakh actually, and these prophecies, and the reason these prophecies were so important is because they heralded the coming of Messiah. Do you suppose when you read these things that you would think about Babylon and what Babylon meant? In context? From 2,000 years ago, actually be longer than that. When it actually happened, 536 or whenever that was, that Babylon was actually destroyed. Now, think about that. Because they would have been thinking about this. This is where audience relevance is so relevant. Pun intended, I guess. This is where it's so relevant because we have to understand the way they saw things, the way they understood things. And there's no way that we can do that unless we understand God's thought processes. And that's what he's teaching us, all 66 books. The way he thinks, not the way we should think. The way that he thinks, how he wants us to think, how he wants us to see things in this, what we call Hebrew mindset. Not the Hellenistic mindset of today, the Greco-Roman kind of thought processes. Okay, so in verse 13, you see these many waters. In verse 1 of Revelation 17, he says, the seven angels who had the seven bowls spoke to me, saying, come here, I'll show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. Babylon sat on many waters. And he says, this great harlot sits on many waters. He equates her to Babylon, and they knew that Babylon was equated to Jerusalem. The similarities are too numerous. He talks about the golden cup in verse 7 of Jeremiah chapter 51. Babylon has been a golden cup in the hand of the Lord, intoxicating all the earth. The nations have drunk of her wine. Therefore, the nations are going mad. And in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 4, listen to this. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and of unclean things of her immorality. Now, wait a minute. So Babylon was the cup in God's hand at one point, and now we see Babylon being equated to Jerusalem, and the golden cup is no longer in God's hand. They are holding the cup. Did you see that? The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations. They took their destiny into their own hands when they rejected Yahweh. Think about it like this. Jesus went into the temple and he cast out evil. And then evil cast Yahweh out of his temple. That's what first century Judaism was. They were the most wicked and corrupt generation of Jews ever, as defined by Deuteronomy chapter 32, as verified by Josephus and others as well, I'm sure. And all we have to do is read this to know, by faith and reading the scriptures, that they were an evil and adulterous generation. Yes, they took their destiny into their own hands when they kicked Yahweh out of his temple. Kind of what we've done in this country when we've cast God out, huh? Taking our destiny into our own hands. Hopefully we don't wind up like them. But anyway, back to this. So here we go. Then we had already talked here about Babylon, the great, the mother of harlots, and the abominations of the earth. Now think about this. I kind of skipped this being intoxicated. I wanted to show you this from verse 7 of Jeremiah 51. My brain works this way sometimes, a little in reverse. So they were all intoxicated in the earth. Did you catch that? Look at verse 6. What does he say here in verse 6? And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered greatly. So here we see this intoxication that's taking place. You know something? The similarities are just too astounding to ignore. And I can assure you that they wouldn't have ignored this, having this information stuck in their heads from the day they were born when they read this. And this was delivered to them in the first century. So, when we look at this and we see that the Old Testament, that Jeremiah is quoted extensively here, there's no question in my mind about that. There's many other things that are quoted too, but this is just what I'm focusing on here. So, there you go. Jeremiah 51 is painting the picture that Jerusalem is Babylon. So is there any question up to this point about who Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth is? You know, she was a harlot. Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 21, Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 6 uses that very terminology. She was a harlot. Very specific. And John says that Babylon the Great was the mother of harlots. You've heard of Moab? Not biblical sense. The mother of all bombs. This is it, right? Babylon was the mother of all harlots and the abominations of the earth. She was leading the lost astray to follow after her abominations. It's kind of sickening, really, when you think about it. Now, can there be any question about the Old Testament talking about this? Well, no. But I want to show you something here in 1 Peter. Let's go to 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 5. Now, this is interesting. See if I can kind of pull this out of here the way I really want to. So, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 12, through Silvanus, our faithful brother, for so I regard him, I have written to you briefly, exhorting and testifying that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it. He says, okay, so now you've got the truth. Stand firm in it. Now, earlier in the chapter, he had just said you need to stand firm, be a partaker of the glory that is about ready to be revealed. It's about to be revealed, not about ready. It's about to. It's mellow, present, indicative, active, I believe, right there. And he says this is the glory that is about to be revealed. What do you suppose he's talking about? Huh? Well, we know what that is. When the chief shepherd appears there in verse 4, you'll receive an unfading crown of glory. Now, notice what he does here, talking about the eschatology. He had just said in verse 17 of chapter 4 that the time for judgment was to begin there with the household of God. Right? This is not a secret to any of us who have studied biblical eschatology and understand it, at least reasonably understand it now. But notice what he does here with Babylon. Notice what he says. She who is in Babylon. Now plug in what we now know about Babylon. And Babylon's, from Jeremiah chapter 51, her impending destruction. Yahweh purposed to destroy Babylon. And you look at Jeremiah 51 verses 13, 14, and 25. He says, I intend to destroy her. And here Peter draws from this imagery. And he says, she who is in Babylon. Where was Peter? Well, Peter, we know, was in Jerusalem. She who is in Babylon, who's getting ready to be destroyed. Her destruction is coming suddenly. The judge is standing at the door. This is all the same imagery. Chosen together with you sends her greetings. And so does my son Mark, and so on. So I think that's what he was doing here. If it stands true in Revelation for how Babylon is used, then why wouldn't it stand true for Peter? And here, it wasn't just being used this way in the Tanakh, in the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament. It was also being used this way by the apostles, by these people inspired by the Spirit in the New Testament. It's inescapable. Why does it even matter? Well, it matters a lot. Because, well, to establish who Babylon is, is to establish the time frame for the events. Because remember what we read from Micah, what we looked at in Jeremiah and all the other passages up to this point. It establishes this time frame of when these things are going to take place in the last days or the latter times. Right? That's what it says. That's what we read. Go back and look at it. If you think I'm crazy, go back and look at it. A lot of people think I'm crazy these days, but hey, that's okay. That's all right. So, this leads us up here in about verse 8 of Revelation chapter 17. Here's what it reads. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to come. Okay, so that's significant. Now think about this. The very time frame that Jesus places on eschatology is for that generation. Well, that fits perfectly with the message of Revelation. It doesn't fit perfectly with Revelation if you want to have Revelation at a later date when nothing was going to happen. Jerusalem had already been destroyed. I mean, the futurist guys have so many problems when it comes to making all these things mesh together. And I feel sorry for them because they're missing out on so much power that is the gospel, that proves that Jesus was victorious, that he was who he said he claimed to be. Now, let's get back to verse 8 before I get off on a tangent. It happens to me every once in a while. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to come up out of the abyss and go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth, whose name was not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will wonder when they see the beast, that he was and is not and will come. Now here's the mind which has wisdom. Okay, so this is, I'm going to focus on this for a little bit. I got about 13 more minutes. The 7 heads are 7 mountains. Okay, so follow this logic. You got these 7 heads that are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Now, who is the woman? Babylon, the great mother. Can you be a mother if you're a guy? No. The mother of harlots. So you've got the woman who sits where? On these 7 mountains. Now, there are those among the futurist camp who are going to say, well, these 7 mountains is Rome. Rome was built on 7 mountains. Yeah, it was. But so were lots of other cities. Now, we can go through history and we can look at these things and, I'm just going to leave this up to you, all right? You figure this out. You do your research and you'll see here that there's no question that Rome was not the only city ever to be built on 7 mountains. Lots of cities were built on 7 mountains. I think I even heard that New York or Boston or one of them was built on 7 mountains, that they did that for good luck. But isn't that ironic that the woman who is Babylon, who we now know is Jerusalem, sits on 7 mountains? Well, the irony there is that she is built on something perfect, complete, 7. I don't know. It's just something to think about. But also consider this, that it says that the 7 heads are 7 mountains. You got these heads on which the woman sits. He says, and they are 7 kings. Now listen to this. He says, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. Now, there's lots of controversy over this. Does this have anything at all to do with the emperors? Well, let's run with that for just a moment. Suetonius says, and he is the authority, and I'm going to go with him on this, guys, because he was there, right? And there are lots of modern scholars who say, well, Julius really wasn't the first Caesar. Suetonius said he was. Most people in the ancient world believed that he was the first emperor, and that's how they started counting, so we're going to do it too. You have Julius. If you don't count him, then it messes up even their whole system, the futurist system, trying to get this written at the time of Domitian. So whatever they want to do, this is going to put this before 70. Anyway, so Julius was the first one. Augustus was the second. Emperor Tiberius, 3. Caligula, 4. Claudius, 5. And the one who is number 6. 5 have fallen. Number 6 is Nero. So how do you get this idea past Nero, who died in 68? which was before the fall of Jerusalem. Now, this is giving us lots of information about when the book was written. He says the one is, this is a present tense, and I'm going to make that argument because I know that Revelation was written before 70. The temple is still standing in Revelation. Lots of other illustrations here. So this is just another one. The internal evidence, the evidence that God gave us is awesome. The evidence that the failed, uninspired, near first century guys left for us, yeah, not so awesome. They're wrong about lots of stuff. So yeah, I'll listen to them and read them, but if it doesn't match up with Scripture, they're wrong. Just saying. Alrighty, so you've got those 7 kings that were 7 heads, right? Now let's keep reading this. And the other one is not yet to come. When he comes, he must remain a little while. And I think all this fits in historically. Verse 11, the beast which was and is not is himself also an 8th and is one of the 7th, and it goes on to destruction. We're not even going to touch that because I need to get to verse 12. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, because you got heads. Where do horns grow? Horns grow on your head. My mom thought I had horns when I was a kid. Just saying. But anyway, so did my 4th grade teacher, come to think of it. Anyway, so you've got these 7 heads and then 10 horns growing on these heads, essentially. Now, let me read this again. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom. So 10 kings without a kingdom. What? But they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. Now, I'm not going to go into the 1 hour thing, but I think this is illustrative of time times and half times, the 42 months, 3.5 years, whatever. But anyway, so this is how long they have authority with him. Okay, they were collaborating. The Jews were collaborating with Rome. They were in cahoots, whatever cahoots means, but they were in it. Okay, so they were collaborating with Rome. Now, think about this. Before I go into the rest of this, let's think about this. Okay, so you've got this collaboration going on. Think about who she sits on. In Revelation chapter 17, verses 1 and 15, she sits on many waters. In Revelation 17, she, the woman, Babylon, sits on the scarlet beast. In Revelation chapter 17, verses 9 and 10, she sits on mountains, which are 7 kings of Rome. Okay, do you see that? So here you've got this woman, Babylon, Jerusalem, sitting on this beast, which seems to be Rome. They were collaborating together. Now, one of the reasons that this is significant is because this was prophesied. This is one of the proofs that Messiah had come. And I just think that this is so powerful. Maybe we should just spend the rest of our time here, but we can't. But let's go to Genesis chapter 49. Now, Genesis chapter 49 and verse 10 says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the gathering of the peoples. My version says the obedience, but I think it should be gathering. In Young's is I think where it says that. But there you go. He says the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes. So when Yeshua comes, when the Messiah that was to come, the Daniel 9, the Messiah was to come, the scepter departs from Jerusalem, from Babylon. Get it? Get the idea? The Jews lose their governing authority. Now listen to a quote here that I have from a guy named Mark Eastman. In his article, The Times of Messiah is Coming, he writes, in the first quarter of the 1st century CE, the Jews were under Roman dominion when an unprecedented event occurred. According to Josephus, Antiquity 1713, around the year 6-7 CE, the son and successor to King Herod, a man named Herod Archelaus, was dethroned and banished to Vienna, a city of Gaul. He was replaced not by a Jewish king, but by a Roman procurator named Coponius. The legal power of the Sanhedrin was immediately restricted. Now, just to add my 2 cents in here, they had autonomy throughout all of their captivities, up until the time that the scepter departs. is when Shiloh comes. Anyway, back to the article. With the ascension of Coponius, the Sanhedrin lost their ability to adjudicate capital cases. This is why they had to go and seek permission from Pilate to put Jesus to death. This was the normal policy toward all nations under the yoke of the Romans. The province of Judea had, however, been spared from this policy up to this point. However, Caesar Augustus, remember he was the second one, had had enough of the Jews and finally removed the judicial authority from them at the ascension of Coponius. This transfer of power was recorded by Josephus. The power of the Sanhedrin to adjudicate capital cases was immediately removed. In the minds of the Jewish leadership, this event signified the removal of the scepter or the national identity of the tribe of Judah. Now I want you to think about this. Plug this in, guys. The mere fact that the Sanhedrin, the Jews, had to go and ask permission to kill Jesus was proof that he was the Messiah. Okay, that just takes my mind and wrings it out in a good way. Wow. So let's get back to this Revelation chapter 17. So they're in collaboration with the Jews and Rome are in collaboration. They're in cahoots with one another. So when we go back and we see here in verse 12, the 10 horns you saw, which are 10 kings who have not received a kingdom. Now, what did we say these kings were? These are 10 kings that have not received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast. What if this is the high priestly system? I'm going to tell you right now, can we nail this down? I don't know. And I, for the life of me, I cannot remember who originally presented this to me. It seems to me like there was an astute Bible student somewhere from I think he was from the Philippines, maybe. I might have this wrong. This has been a while, and I failed, and I apologize to note who this was. So if somebody knows, let me know. But I think maybe Adam Marschalk presented this, but I truly don't remember. And I simply did not have time in the haste to do this, to do the research. But anyway, I want to present this because this made halfway sense to me. So you've got these kings, these high priests of Revelation chapter 17. The ones, remember, from Jesus, and he said, to whom do the sons pay, or do the sons have to pay tribute? Anyway, so you've got the first one. See if you see a pattern here. You got the first one was Ananus, son of Seth, 6 to 15. Eleazar, son of Ananus, 16 to 17. Joseph, son of Caiaphas, 18 to 36. He was the son-in-law of Ananus. Jonathan, son of Ananus, 36 to 37 and in 44. And then you've got Theophilus, son of Ananus, 37 to 41. Matthias, son of Ananus, 43. Ananus, son of Ananus, you see the trend here, 62. And then you've got Matthias, son of Theophilus, 65 and in 66. So essentially this works out to having these 10 priests, Jews, on top of the heads of the kings. They're sitting on their heads again, riding on them. They're in cahoots. Remember, they're collaborating with the Jews, or collaborating with Rome. Now, why were they doing this? They were doing this. Notice what it says here in verse 15. He said, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are the peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues, and the 10 horns which you saw and the beast. These all hate the harlot and will make her desolate and naked and will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Now, I don't think this is necessarily talking about cannibalism, although I'm convinced that did happen, but I think it was rare. But it's more or less that they were cannibalizing themselves in a metaphoric way. Their own, killing their own and starving their own out and acting out on their wicked and evil impulses. By having a common purpose, it says, and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. Now, wait a minute. I hear Matthew 5, 17 and 18 there. Jesus said, I didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. I didn't come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. Every jot and tittle. That's what I hear right there. Until the words of God, this is Revelation 17:17, until the words of God will be fulfilled. The woman whom you saw is the great city. Who is the great city? Revelation 11 teaches us that. It's the city where our Lord was crucified. Where was he crucified? We know the answer to that. The woman whom you saw, verse 18, is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. Now, when you look at this idea of reigns, my mind footnotes this and says, it should read like this, which has a kingdom over the kings of the earth. So the woman whom you saw is the great city, which has a kingdom over the kings of the earth. And maybe that makes a little more sense. So when we look at these things and we see what's going on here, the evidence becomes overwhelming. Now, that leaves me pretty much out of time. I want to talk a little more about the war that is mentioned here in verse 14. But I'm going to do that more in my next presentation from Revelation chapter 20. But notice what it says in verse 15. These will wage war against the Lamb. And I just want to make this mention, that this wasn't just any war. This was the war. Talk about, it was said that World War I was the war to end all wars. Well, no. This one was the war. And we'll see why that is so important in our next time together. I want to thank you very much, and I'll leave this with you and look forward to seeing you the next time. Thank you.